rolling pin. Cardboards. Don't have any of those. Stones. Peels. Ugh. Let's see. Breadcrumbs. I think we're about good to go. Yeast. We need some yeast, buddy. Excuse you. Have you heard that the bird is the word? The bird's the word. Everybody knows that the bird is the word. Oh, I need a new fridge. All right, anybody that's out there, this is Josh Downey, co-founder of Chicago Johnny's Condiments, Spices, and Giardiniera. I use olive oil in my giardiniera. It's available at all Jewel Osco stores, as well as my Midwestern cherry bourbon barbecue sauce, which we're not going to use today because we're doing pizzas. But there's a recipe in the book that uses barbecue sauce for a chicken fontina pizza. What's going on here? Scam likely. Should I answer it? All right, sorry about that. So I'm Josh Downey. I founded Chicago Johnny's company, Giardiniera Condiments and Spices. I make my giardiniera with olive oil and a ton of spices. It's red in color. There's just a ton of freaking spices in there. Available locally at Jewel Osco stores around Chicago, as well as my cherry bourbon barbecue sauce on store shelves. I have also released recently the Chicago Pizza Cookbook in paperback, hardcover, and downloadable formats. And today we're going to make a recipe from the book. I got a lot of requests on doing a video on making the dough because the way that I do the dough is pretty unique. It's unstandard, not standard, non-standard. And the process and the layering of the ingredients and how that goes. So we're going to do Uncle Pepper's Crispy Chicago Dough. This is, I guess, what I would call my standard. It's good for deep dish, good for thin crust. It's pretty universal. As far as toppings you want to put on it, when you're making pizza, you want to be kind of conscious on the topping combinations to the flours you're using in your dough. For instance, this is a semolina whole wheat dough. It's a very dark and earthy flavor, so this lends well to sauteed spinach, mushrooms, the darker flavors. It's also really good for like rolling flavors of like a prosciutto, dried prosciutto, roasted red peppers, red onions, sometimes bacon, something like that. This one's a sourdough recipe, and they're all in here. But this one uses sourdough, so it's a little more funky. It's already got some depth to it. so you don't want to overload that on the toppings. Kind of want to let that crust flavors shine through. So for this recipe, if you want to get a pen and paper, we'll go through it and do it here in a second. But you're going to start by putting 1 gram of yeast, which is about 1/5 of a teaspoon, 61 grams of water, which is about 1/4 cup plus 1/8 of a tablespoon. Mix that together, let it sit for a minute. Once you know that your yeast is alive, then you can add your fat. In this case, we're going to use some butter, and this is clarified butter from a dry aged roast that I made a couple months ago. So clarified the butter. I rubbed the roast in butter and then dry aged it, and then took the butter and clarified it. So now I have a ton of butter. We'll use that. See how it works. I haven't actually used clarified butter in a pizza dough yet, so curious to see how that will turn out. But you could substitute pretty much any fat. So you could do an olive oil, you could do lard, you could do bacon fat, duck fat, coconut oil, whatever you want. So yeast, 1 gram, water, 61 grams, butter or fat, 10 grams, salt, 2 grams, and we're using Sarasota flour, which is pretty common out here in the Midwest. On the East Coast, it's called Hecker's brand flour, but it's the same flour, just a different label. I think out west they use Hecker's as well, but I'm not positive. The difference between Sarasota flour, Hecker's flour, and other flours is the gluten content. So normally an all-purpose flour is kind of here as far as gluten goes, and then cake flour and the lighter flours. And then bread flour is kind of up here in the really high area of gluten. And then somewhere in between the all-purpose and the bread flour is Sarasota or Hecker's. So it's got some strength to it. It builds up gluten really well. And it's not so soft. So this is a very good crispy dough flour. So we're going to do 140 grams of that, and that is going to give us 1 dough ball. The dough ball will be about 214 grams. And when we roll out the pizza, it's going to be a 12-inch pizza. And you could use the 214 grams if you want, or you trim it back. And then I usually end up about 198, 196 after I trim it. You can go as low as 160 if you want incredibly thin pizza, or you can use the whole thing. So you do want a scale. If you are making pretty much anything that you need precise measurements for, a scale is your friend. So we're going to do in grams. But 61 grams of water is always 61 grams of water, but 1/4 cup of water, sometimes less than that, sometimes more than that. So for consistency, especially if you're doing like cakes, baking, pizzas, doughs, breads, use a scale. This is just the normal yeast you can get off the shelf. I use active dry, I don't use instant. Don't add sugar there might be one recipe in here with sugar. And it's a same day dough, so that's why I put the sugar in there to get it really invigorated. But other than that, I don't normally use sugar. I haven't found a benefit for it, other than if you're making the dough right away, or making the pizza from the dough right away. So we're going to start out with 1 gram, and you'll see here as we go, there is. We're going to start with. We'll get to the hook, but we're going to start with the paddle in the mixer because it's such a dry dough, it's low hydration. It's only 43% hydration, and if you're an East Coast person, you're probably used to something like 60 to 70% hydration, or Detroit even higher than that. A lot of the pan pizzas are very high hydration. This is a very low hydration dough, and the reason for that is we don't need a whole lot of steam happening in the dough to rise it, because we're not going for that. We want thin and crispy all throughout. So that's why we do this. We need some water. So what is important when you get water is not so much the temperature, but that it's fairly clean water. If you get your tap water is full of a lot of chlorine, a lot of bleach, it can kill the yeast. So if you can use filtered water, or you have to get bottled water because your water's crap wherever you live, do that. We're going 61 grams of water. Now, water is a little more difficult to get accurate. So pay attention while you're doing it. And in this book, I go through a lot of techniques, and there's only like 14 or 15 recipes. Most of it's about technique and processes. And one of the things I talk about is the ingredients and weighing them and the accuracy of it. Now, if I'm making one dough ball, 61 grams of water, I should be as close to 61 grams of water as I can. If I'm making 4 times the recipe, it's not as important to be at 61 grams each time. It's important, but it's not. You have more leeway. You know, if I'm off by a gram here, we're at like 1.5%, 1.8% off where we wanted to be. If I'm off a gram or two on a ×4 batch, we're at 0.5%. So you can see how accuracy matters. Give it a little stir. And I prepped a lot of the stuff before I went live. Hopefully I have everything. I am notoriously bad at planning things. Obviously I have dough already made from the other day that we're going to use today. This is just to get the process going so you guys can see how I make dough different than most other people are going to do. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to put salt in before we knead the dough. Almost every dough recipe for bread or pizza, you're putting the salt in at the end because it restricts the gluten formation. And what we want is very tight gluten formation, like not big long strands that you get a real puffy dough, New York style or wood fire style. You get the big puffs, air bubbles, stuff like that. We want tight, constricted gluten structure. So we're gonna put salt in before we knead it, and then when we're kneading it to try to build up a little bit of gluten, we're not building up long strands, we're building up real short strands. And that'll help us get a thin, crispy dough, or a thin, crispy deep dish if you want to do it that way. This recipe in particular is fantastic for deep dish or thin crust. Most places in the Chicago area will use the same dough recipe for their thin crust and their deep dish. I'm not a pizza joint. I'm doing this at home. And I make notes on here, which ones are good for deep dish, which ones are good for thin crust, and what's good for both. All right, so now do our butter. There's another thing. Usually people will put the butter, the fat, whatever fat they're using. You put that in towards the end. With this, again, you can put almost everything in at the same time and just go with it, because we're not trying to build up those long gluten strands. There we go. Again, this is clarified butter, so what that means is I just removed some of the butterfat solids. So ghee, it's basically ghee. It is ghee. But this particular butter has an interesting storyline because I dry aged a roast for dry aged steaks over the winter. And to do that, I rolled the whole thing in butter, patted a bunch of butter on it, so it's clearly sealed in butter, in the fridge for 50 days. Then I took that butter and melted it and rendered out the moisture, skimmed it, cooled it, and did it again. And what you're left with is just the fat, no solids. You know, the solids are taken away. So this will actually hold up to a higher temperature as well if you're pan frying. But I'm ranting, so let's go on here. So I did 10 grams of butter. Before that, I did a gram of yeast, 61 grams of water, and now we're going to do Sarasota flour. 140 grams. Sarasota brand flour and Hecker's brand flour are the same. King Arthur probably makes something that's in between as well. So what you're looking for is something with more gluten content than all-purpose flour, but less than bread flour. Now, if I was making this the next day, bread flour would be fine. It would actually be beneficial. If you're making the same day or next day, bread flour will hold its structure better, give you more crisp. The downfall of bread flour is it's got like some resistance, some pull, some chew to it. And for what we're doing, we don't want that. And then salt. 1 gram. And I like to put the salt in right on top of the flour. And then we're going to start with the paddle for this recipe. The reason being, again, is it's such a low hydration dough that if we try to go straight to the hook, we're going to have all kinds of problems. So we're going to put this until basically it comes together. And then, well, actually it won't come together because it's got the paddle. It's going to look like a bunch of scrap, almost like a schnitzel. You know, if you ever made schnitzel or you're familiar with schnitzel. It's going to look like that. It's not really going to come together. So we're going to mix it so the ingredients are there. Then we're going to let it rest for a few minutes, and that's going to allow the water to hydrate into the flour. And once that hydrates into the flour, then we can go to the dough hook. There we go. So this is a real shaggy mess. You can see it almost looks like the breading on KFC chicken. Again, this is low hydration. This is normal for my recipes. So we're gonna keep all of this in the bowl. And you could cover it if you want with a towel, or you can even use your fingers to try and get it to come together better. But it will come together. And then we'll go to the dough hook. So we're gonna let it sit for a minute, and that's gonna allow the water to absorb into the flour, and then we'll be able to knead it to make a dough ball. So this is my book, the Chicago Pizza Cookbook. It's available on Amazon in the link below. Paperback, hardcover, or downloadable. It's getting really good reviews so far. It's been received very well, which is nice. It's always nerve-wracking when you start something from scratch and you're going a little bit against the grain, against the norm, and you don't know how that's going to be received. So that's nice. This Uncle Pepper's Crispy Chicago Dough. This is the recipe I've been working on for probably 12 years, and I just started from zero. I knew pretty much what goes into pizza dough, the ingredients. So I just started mixing them until I got close to a consistency that I wanted. And then from there, I started taking notes and narrowing them down. And over the course of 12 years, this is what I ended up with. Each recipe in the book has the hydration content, which I think is very important. Lets you know how wet a dough is going to be, how hard it's going to be to work with, kind of the result you're getting at the end. In this particular case, we're at 45.57% hydration, so it's very low hydration, which helps us with our crispy result that we're looking for. I also add the fat percentage, and even though the fat percentage doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the flour and how it hydrates, it does, but it's not as much as the water. It's important because it kind of lets you know the mouthfeel you're going to have, the texture you're going to get at the end of it, the crispness, if it's going to be a heavy dough. But then I have this thing called inclusive, and that's the fat and the hydration together. I put that in all the recipes, but I haven't found a consistency as to what it does to the dough yet. I know there's something there, I just don't know what it is. So I put that in there in case anybody out there wants to play with it and see what they come up with. For thin crust pizza in particular, I have oven setups for if you're doing deep dish or if you're doing thin crust. And thin crust, if you have an extra stone, which I do, I put one rack as low as it'll go in the oven, put a stone on it. Then one rack as high as it'll go in the oven, or one notch below that, depending on how your oven's set up, and put a stone in there. We're always going to cook on the bottom stone. But if you happen to go heavy on the cheese and the ingredients, the toppings, if you're using a lot of wet ingredients, I will pull from the bottom stone and move it up to the top stone. And the heat from the top of the oven helps to dry out some of the wet ingredients on the top or brown the cheese even more. So you have options when you're cooking. You can go from lower to high to finish it off. I don't always use it, but you can't put it in when you need it if you need it. So I always put it in the beginning. Today I'm actually using granite countertop instead of pizza stone. About 12 years ago, I went to a counter place in Island Lake, and I had read a newspaper article from like want to say it was the 50s, 40s, 50s, about Italian immigrants, and it had a woman in there, and it was translated, and she was saying that she got a piece of countertop for her oven to make bread on. I thought it sounded really interesting, so I went, got some countertop pieces, and that's what I use. Most of the time. I have stones as well. All the recipes in the book were made on stone, so there's consistency from what I was making to what you would make. But I do prefer the countertop. It's bigger, it's thicker, it holds the heat better. It's got little inconsistencies in the stone, so there's hot spots and cold spots, so you get different texture throughout the pizza. I appreciate stuff like that. It's not for everybody, but I do appreciate that. So I'm shaking the bowl, and it's not, see, it's a little loose now, but not totally loose. We're going to see if we're ready to come together with the dough hook now. And I need a container to put that in. You grab me a couple of cardboards from the basement if you go down there? I don't need them now, but like 20 minutes or so. This is a pretty old KitchenAid. I'd say this thing is close to 20 years old now at this point. Maybe even more than that. But I love it. Why it just works, why not keep using it? The only thing is there's an adjuster, a screw on these. If you get the newer ones, they're a lot easier to work with. You can raise and lower the bowl. And so my hook is a little too high, but I can't get that going. And I missed the Black Friday sales this year. I don't want to pay full price for one of these things. So sometimes I have to do this. It looks pretty unprofessional, but we're at home. If you're having trouble getting this to come together, you look weird. Am I weird? I'm probably weird. If you're having trouble getting this together, this is the water. You dip your finger in there, flick it in, and kind of like when you're doing pie crust, just to the point that it comes together. And then at that point, stop adding water. Because the more water we add, the more water we have to get to cook out when we're baking it. You can also use your hand to get it. Oh, I feel some pieces on the bottom that didn't come together. Use your hand to get it to form kind of a ball, like that. And then it should come together now. Humidity in the air, slight differences in the measurements, all these things can affect how the dough comes together. Because this is basically bare minimum hydration for your dough to come together, it's like bare minimum. Sometimes you need to add a little water, which we will do. So I'm just dipping my fingers in here and flicking it into the dough. Huh? You can't see the mixer? That's fine. There's just a mixer going. I'll show you guys the dough here when it comes together. So I did twice. I dipped my fingers in there, flicked it in. It's starting to come together a little bit here. I could probably use one more. There we go. It will come together. So in this dough, if you're just joining us, I started with 1 gram of yeast, 61 grams of water. Let that sit for a minute. Then add 140 grams of flour. In this case, we're using Sarasota or Hecker's brand. It's the same flour under a different label. 2 grams of salt and 10 grams of fat. In this case, we're using butter. And actually, in this case, we're using clarified butter, which is coming off of a dry roasted, what kind of steak was that? What roast is that? Prime rib roast. It was on sale over winter, so I picked one up, rubbed the whole thing down in butter, put it in the fridge for 45, 50 days, take it out, get your butter back, and then clarify it. And then the steaks you trim and you cut them and freeze dry them. Touch more. We'll go through some tips here. If you're using something like onion or pepper, if you could prep it the day before, put it in a container with a towel, put a lid on it, and put it in the fridge. The towel will help absorb some of that moisture. It'll dry it out a little bit, and it just gives us a step up when we go into the oven with the pizza. Because with the Chicago dough, what we're trying to do is use as little hydration and water as possible. And all of these recipes are not this low hydration. This one is. This one is the first recipe I started making. And so, actually, at the time that I started, I was not aware of hydration content. I just noticed that the lower hydration worked better. Must be dry in here today, huh? Well, for the purposes of the video, why don't I just do this to get it going? There we go. There we go. Oh, I wonder if Bowie lowered this. All right, we're coming together. What we're going to end up with is not this. This is a smooth dough ball. This is what you want. This has been in cold ferment for 4 days now. When did I make this? Today's 4 days. This has been cold ferment for 4 days. So we're going to make this dough, put it in a container. We're going to leave it on the counter for 4 to 8 hours. That's going to give it its first proofing and get the yeast active. You're going to knock it down, cover it back up, and put it in the fridge for anywhere from overnight to 7 days. You can go longer than 7 days. The yeast starts to die off, and you'll have a real big funk. If you're familiar with like Pecorino Romano cheese or Fontanella cheese, the dough starts to develop those kind of characteristics. I prefer somewhere between 3 and 5 days. Most people are going to do the same day or next day. If you're making it at home or you got a local pizza joint. Some places will go 4 days, 5 days, 6 days. I prefer 3 to 5. I probably hover around 4. And the reason being is it has enough time for the yeast to kind of do its thing, but not become too funky. So it doesn't taste yeasty, and it doesn't taste funky. It's somewhere in the middle. That's my preference, but you'll figure out what you like as you go. So, you will run it, depending on what part of the country you're in, time of season. If this was summer here in the Chicago area, this would have come together without adding any water to it. It's enough humidity in the air, nothing's pulling from it. It would have worked out fine. Because we're in the middle of a dry winter, well, the end of a dry winter, it's very dry in here. So the water was not enough. So I probably added about 6 to 8 grams of water, but don't do that at first. Start with the 61 grams of water. And if it doesn't come together, then you could add your water to it. The more water we add to it, and this is basically what I would call a throwaway dough anyway, because I'm just going to make sausage bread with it or something. This is just to show you guys the process. So I'm not worried about the extra hydration that I added in there. So I'm not going to use this for pizza. I'll use this for sausage bread or stromboli, I think they call it. This is an important note when you're using a KitchenAid mixer. About 200 grams total is like the lowest amount that you'd want to go. And the reason being is this exactly right here, is that you need some volume to wrap around the hook to get it to work around and stuff like that. I didn't do that, so if this was doubled the recipe, we wouldn't be having these issues. And you could double the recipe, triple the recipe. I think 4 of this, about 800 grams to 1,000 grams, is the maximum you want on this particular KitchenAid. This is an old one. It's a smaller version. They must make a much larger version. What is this? 5 quart? I think it's 4.5 quart. That's what it is. It's not super voluminous. Voluminous? It's not a whole lot of volume. That can be held in this bowl. So for a single ball, it's going to come out kind of looking like a head of cauliflower, which I have pictures of in the book. Oh, here's Sarasota. So this is the flour type we're using. Sarasota or Hecker's brand, depending on what part of the country you're in. The reason I like this flour is because it holds, it says a gluten content in between all-purpose, which is a little softer, and bread flour, which is a little tougher. So it gives us a good consistency. All right, we're coming together there. So we're going to end up with something that looks a little more like cauliflower, but a smooth dough ball. And that's perfectly fine. That's what we want for this particular recipe. If you're making wood fire, New York, even Detroit style pizza, you want that smooth, elastic texture when you're making it, because you want the high gluten content, you want the long gluten strands. Here we want short gluten strands, so tight, so they're crispy, crunchy. So you're going to end up with something that looks like this. This very much looks like a head of cauliflower or a brain. We're going to take this, put it in a sealed container. You could even use a Ziploc bag. That's what I usually use. We'll leave it on the counter for 48 hours. We'll knock it down, cover it again, put it in the fridge, anywhere from overnight to 7 days. You can use this the same day. The longer, if you go less than like 12 hours from the start of making your dough to making the pizza, you're not giving the flour enough time to absorb the water, the hydration. And for this style of dough in particular, we want that. You especially want that if you're going for like the big puffy bubbles and shit like that, like the New York or the wood fire, Neapolitan. This is not so necessary. You can do same day. I prefer not doing same day. It's up to you. All right, so now we are ready to make pizza. We need tomatoes. Look at that. Tomatoes. This is a good mid to high level grade. This is Di Fratelli. I don't know how you fucking pronounce this. Just straight crushed tomatoes. And for price to quality ratio, this is very good. If you're going to spend money on your pizza, I feel like it's less important to spend it on the flour, very important to spend on the tomatoes, pretty important to spend on the cheese, and then the toppings, depending on what you're going for. If you're going for like a loaded pizza, you don't need the best quality of everything. There's so much happening on a loaded pizza that you can get lower grade quality for the toppings. If you're going for a simple, clean pizza, the better the tomato, the better end product you're going to have. What the hell am I looking? Oh, so. I generally don't season the sauce for thin crust. I will use, this is another one of my products, Chicago Johnny's Perfect Pizza Seasoning. It's available on TikTok, Amazon, Walmart, ChicagoJohnny's.com, all online. This is probably our #1 seller. Rave reviews. It works really freaking well. It's basically the stuff you smell when you walk into a pizza joint in Chicago area: garlic, onion, oregano, basil. There's some salt, crushed red pepper, which is a big thing out here. I love crushed red pepper. I go through one of these about every 2 months, just for me. So we will use that. We'll put that on top of the pizza, just for visual effect. Well, we'll give it a lot of flavor. I'm putting it on top of the pizza instead of on top of the sauce for visual effect. So we need some flour to roll our dough out. Don't worry about incorporating too much or too little flour, especially at this point. With this style of dough, we're not like folding it over or anything, so we're not actually adding too much flour into the pizza itself. Just make sure you got a healthy coat on it. I start by pressing it out a little bit, and then we're going to roll it from center out. If we start at the edge and go that way, it seems to work the dough too much. So if we start center out, and then I'm not putting any pressure when I come back, center out, center out, center out. No pressure on the return. Then we can rotate our dough. And with Chicago pizza in particular, it's not so important as to which side is the top, which side is the bottom, unless you're curing the dough, which is in the book too. If you're doing a Neapolitan or New York style, then it's more important to keep that skin intact. But we're not looking for the big puffy bubbles or anything like that. So for us, it's not as important. Keep rolling, center out, center out. This is 214 grams of dough, and we're going to make a 12-inch pizza, which usually I have my pizza circles to trim it. I forgot them in the basement. I wonder if this is 12 inches. Oh, shit. 16 inches, 15 and a half. All right, we'll play around with this best we can. That's about a foot. The smaller you go with the pizza, the thicker your crust is going to be. You can go a little wider. You know, if you can get to 15 inches without trimming it, or 13 inches without trimming it, you'll have a thin pizza, which is nice. Generally what we're going for. I try to keep it around 12 inches, and I lose some of the crust in the trimming. So there's another important part that I go through in the book as well. We made our dough, let it rise, knock it down, put it in the fridge. Take it out after 4 days. If you're going to shape it, make it a ball, or you're going to divide it, so you made a batch of 8, you want to divide it in 4, do that first, right when you take it out, shape it, because then you're getting the gluten all excited again. It's not loose. It's not going to want to roll out smooth and thin and get, you know, it's excited. It's working. It's tight, you know. So that makes it a little harder to roll out. So if you shape your dough or you get the gluten all excited, then you go to shape it, it's going to shrink back. It's going to pull back because it's tense, it's tight. You want to loose, chill, you know, relaxed. Totally normal to get some curling like this. Oh, these are probably in your guys' way, huh? We'll go rustic with this because I don't have the circles. So we're a little over 12 inches for this one. My guess is 12 and a half, 13 inches. All right. Still fit on the peel, which means will fit on my board or my stone, so that's good. We are going to I go through this in the book as well. You can use breadcrumbs on your peel. You want something on your peel to prevent the dough from sticking to it. You always want your dough loose and ready to slide off. Because what happens is the dough sits, right? We put water in here, or whatever hydration we use, milk or beer or wine, whatever. It's releasing that moisture. And what happens is it releases between the counter or whatever surface and the dough. And if you imagine like you put the dough on a wet surface, it's going to stick. It's not going to move around. We want this pizza to slide off smooth. So we use either cornmeal, semolina flour, breadcrumbs. Some people just use flour. You could add flour to the board. But be aware that everything you're putting on the board or on the peel is going to go into your oven. And if you have too much of something on here, it's going to stay in there and it's going to burn. So we want just enough to get it loose and not enough to smoke out the oven. Today I'm using breadcrumbs. You can use cornmeal if you like the texture, which I do. I like to change it up a little bit. That's a big one, huh? 13 by 14. We are going to trim this guy up a little bit. Just because I don't normally work with dough. Could you grab those cardboards? I don't normally work with crust this large. Also, my hand-eye coordination is that of a doofus. So this, you can save your scraps and add them to your next dough to get them going. Actually, I'll do that. I just made dough. Why not keep it? Just grab like 6. And we'll mix that in when I go to knock it down. And it'll just add a little bit more funk into our pizza. So we have our breadcrumbs down. I give it a shake. We're loose. That's good. That's perfect. I prefer to dock the crust. This is going to help prevent those bubbles that form, which I do, I appreciate them, but they are unsightly. I dock heavier than most people. There's not a ton of yeast in this dough, so it doesn't really have the tendency to give you those big air bubbles. They call it crumb. But we're just going to prevent it anyway. So breadcrumbs are on there, keeping us loose. Thank you. Next step is straight crushed tomatoes. I don't season or cook them. A lot of people in the area will add sugar. I don't really like the sweet sauce. I like more the fresh, I guess I'd call it. Crisp, bright, acidic. I like the tomatoes to shine through on themselves. That's what I was saying earlier. If you're going to spend somewhere on pizza or you're trying to save money on pizza, don't save it on the tomatoes. Get good tomatoes. And the price of tomatoes is not an indication of the quality. The imported tomatoes are not an indication of quality. The best tomatoes I've found consistently are California tomatoes, Stanislaus brand, 7-Eleven or 9-11 ground, 710 ground tomatoes, whatever that is. It's been one hell of a week. Give the board another shake, make sure we're loose. And then we're gonna do a classic Chicago pizza, thin crust, bell pepper, onion, Italian sausage. Now our oven's at 500 degrees, and we're gonna be in somewhere between 9 and 13 minutes. Depending on how thick your crust is, how many toppings you put on there, how brown you want it well done. There's enough time for raw sausage to cook. So in this area, you will often find raw Italian sausage on pizza. In almost every other part of the country, maybe even every other part of the country, the standard is cooked sausage. Whether it's crumbled like this or sliced in links, it is cooked. if you happen to know of another area that does this, and not like a particular pizza joint that's Chicago style, but another area, St. Louis might do it. I see a lot about St. Louis pizza on the internet now. St. Louis might be doing this actually. It's pretty similar in style. They cut it a little different, although a lot of people would say we cut our pizza a little different in St. Louis. And they use a different cheese called Provel cheese, which is like a pasteurized processed cheese. So from what I understand, it's a very different experience. I have never been to St. Louis to try it out. All right, since we worked with raw sausage, wash our hands. Very pretty sun today. Our kitchen window faces straight north. So as summer comes, we'll get a lot more sunlight, which I guess is pretty standard everywhere. All right, so breadcrumbs, dough, sauce, and then you could do your sharp cheese or your under the cheese toppings and then sharp cheese. So I have under the cheese toppings and over the cheese toppings, and I go through that in the book, depending on what result you're looking for. Look up the Chicago Pizza Cookbook on Amazon, or go to chicagojohnnies.com. You can order it. There's under the cheese toppings and over the cheese toppings, and some can go either way. Bell pepper and onion can go under or above. This dough is pretty thin, so I don't think we're gonna be there in the oven that long. So I'll do onion under and some pepper on top. So this is just sliced raw onion. Try to slice it pretty thin. My knife skills are shit. For whatever reason, it just never came to me. If you are prepping this beforehand, which I do recommend, I didn't get to do that today, do it the day before. Put it in a steel container with a paper towel. Paper towel will help absorb a lot of that moisture, and then you won't have to worry about baking it off as much. These are fairly wet onions, and had I felt them before I decided, I would have put them on top of the cheese so they have some time to dry out. But potato. I like a mix of provolone and whole milk mozzarella. So this is provolone. I don't know what is more common these days. It seems like a lot more people are going to the all whole milk mozzarella route, especially the newer joints. But I like a roughly 50-50 mix of provolone, and this isn't the real sharp provolone you get like in the half wheel from the shelves, real sharp, funky stuff. This is from the deli, so the big round thing. They slice it for you. It's mild. It's not like funky, you know. But there's a lot of resistance you get from the provolone. You get like a pull, a stringiness, a bite to it, or what I refer to a lot of times as resistance. This is Galbani brand whole milk mozzarella, which not everybody can get. But the important thing when you're getting your mozzarella is that you get low moisture. So if a lot of places, the only way you can do that is that you get part skim whole milk, part skim mozzarella that's low moisture. We're lucky we get low moisture whole milk mozzarella out here, and it just adds a little bit more flavor. And you want low moisture because if you're not using low moisture, this will melt and run off, ooze, and you'll have a mess everywhere. It will not stay. The low moisture is already released a lot of its moisture, so it doesn't spread as much, which is what we're going for. You'll see me every now and again, I go to shake the peel. It's very important to keep this pizza loose so it'll slide out. There's not really a time limit as to how long the pizza can sit on here. As long as you keep shaking it and releasing it, It's okay. If I let it sit too long without going to shake it, it will stick. Don't want to do that. Also, wooden peel. If you're new to this, wooden peel for me works wonderfully, and breadcrumbs, for whatever reason, seem to work the best for keeping it loose among the semolina, cornmeal, flour, or breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs seem to keep it the loosest. On a wood peel, because that allows the wood will wick some of that moisture. So if there is some moisture that starts to form, the wood will kind of take it. If you're using a metal peel, there's nowhere for that moisture to go. So you have your crust that's releasing moisture, a metal pan with nowhere for that moisture to go, and you're going to stick. But this one, the moisture can wick into the wood a little bit. Not like crazy, but enough that it'll keep it loose. One trick for doing your toppings, especially your vegetable toppings, is to use a mandolin. You can get real thin cuts with that. You get consistency. As you can see, I opted not to use a mandolin today. So I cotton-headed mini muggins. In the book, there are weights and measures for all this stuff. Sauce is somewhere around 85 grams as your normal. Cheese about 160 to 180. This is all for a 12-inch thin crust. Sausage, I don't remember. And the vegetables depends if you're doing diced or sliced, believe it or not, as far as the weight, how much you want to put on there. So this is just Chicago Downey's Perfect Pizza Seasoning. It's available online. It gives it all the flavor I'm looking for, and that's part of the reason I don't season the crushed tomatoes on the thin crust pizzas, is because there's so much flavor in this that it gives us everything we need. You'll notice I tried to wipe all the excess breadcrumbs and spice, because all that's going to go in the oven. It's not going to help us to have it in the oven. If it's not on the pizza or working for the pizza, try not to get it in the oven. You will get some in there, but try not to get it in there. We're loose. We give it some shakes. We're going to put it on the bottom stone. Oh, yeah. We're going to set a timer. We'll check this one at 10 minutes. So here's an important note. The oven has been running the whole time I'm talking to you, right? So the stone is hotter now than it's going to be when I go to do my next pizzas. So this pizza is probably going to need less time. I might want to move it from the bottom to the top, because what's going to happen, as I was showing you in this book earlier, the Chicago Pizza Cookbook, what is going to happen, this is our oven setup. So when we're doing thin crust pizzas, we have a stone on the lowest rack and a stone on the highest rack, or one below the highest rack, depending on how your oven's set up. You want some space between the top of the pizza and the top of the oven, but not a ridiculous amount. We always start baking on the bottom stone because it's hotter. That's going to help the crust get rid of a lot of that hydration. It's going to crisp it up real nice. In this case, the oven's been going on for about 2 hours, so this stone is as hot as it could get, probably. So we might have to move the pizza from the bottom stone to the top stone, where the top heat is way more intense. And what that's going to help us do is that's going to help to dry out the top, brown the cheese better, and not really burn the crust. This stone doesn't get as hot as this stone. This stone's right by the heat element, or in this case, the gas. So this stone will get incredibly hot. This stone will get pretty hot. This stone is hot as it's going to get right now, but as I put pizzas on, it'll take away some of the heat. So we're going to start at 10 minutes. Normally, for the pizza you guys saw me make, it'd probably be about 12 minutes, 13 minutes for medium well-done pizza to get a texture and a color like this. That's beautiful. There's a gorgeous color on the bottom of the crust. So this is the Chicago Pizza Cookbook. It's my notes and techniques from over a decade of working on pizzas. Everything in here is original, except for one recipe, which isn't even all these recipes are mine from scratch. I wanted different end results, so I worked backwards to get the result I wanted from what I knew worked to what I wanted. So all these recipes are my own except for this one, which is the first published deep dish recipe pizza from Chicago. A guy named Rick Ricardo published this at some point, or somebody published his recipe in the 40s. And when this was being made, it was more of a pan pizza and less of a deep dish that you would expect. I just thought the history behind this was so cool that I didn't want to mess with it. I put it in as is. I do put some variations in that I would do to manipulate it as you go, but I wanted this to shine on its own. But all the other recipes are mine. I have a Lou Malnati's knockoff recipe. There's a semolina whole wheat crust. This one has a little bit of bite, a little chew, but it's very earthy, dark flavors. This lends itself really well to like aged meats, like prosciutto. So if you could balance some bright acidic, like a roasted red pepper, quick pickled red onion, something like that. You balance that with sautéed spinach, some tomatoes, slices, prosciutto, some aged meats. This crust is very good for that. And I go through the whole process in here and the notations on what you want to be conscious of when you're deciding what crust recipe with what toppings. And there's no right answer. These are what I found to be in my favor, but you're going to end up doing what you like. I encourage you to write notes in here, to change stuff. If you're making all these recipes just the way that I gave them to you and not putting your own spin on it, totally fine. I feel like you're just accepting it, though. I want you to make it your own. Play with it a little bit. Change the fats, change the hydrations, change the percentages. If you like them the way they are, make note of that. And then you have the way that I make it, and then make the way you make it. I have a cornmeal crust recipe. This is probably my most requested recipe. Cornmeal crust. This is something that the way people talk about it, I think it was a lot more common in the Chicago area than it is now. Not a whole lot of places use cornmeal anymore in the crust, but at one point it sounds like there were quite a few doing that. I have a Lou Malnati's recipe in here. I kind of reverse engineered this based on like the calorie content and the ingredients of Lou Malnati's. I guess this isn't my recipe either. So there's two recipes in here that are not exactly mine. I did adapt this one a little bit. This school lunch pizza. If you remember, it came in the big sheet pan. It was cut into like 8 rectangles. It was wet, but it's nostalgic. You know, actually, for Michelle's birthday, I made this and a bunch of other pizzas, and this is the one everybody gravitated towards because they hadn't had it in 15, 20, 30 years. This recipe is pretty easy to make. The one big note I would say is if you're making this recipe is to make the sauce the night before and put it in the fridge so it has time to stiffen up. That will prevent it from being too sloppy, too wet. It's made with tomato paste, and so you really want that to blend well with everything going on. This is what I call a novelty pizza. This is Italian beef gravy fat. So you make your Italian beef, if you're not familiar with it, is like the bear, the show The Bear, they make it in there. That's why it's such a big thing out here. Make your Italian beef, chill the gravy, and the layer of fat forms on the top. Take that out because you don't need that when you're making the sandwiches anyway. But it tastes as much of Italian beef as you can get in a fat. So I take that and I use it instead of butter or oil in the dough. And then you could do it with crushed tomatoes, or you could take some of that fat, make a roux, thin it out with some beef gravy, get it pasty, and then you use that for your sauce. The one thing I would say about that is the gravy doesn't hold its form very well, so it'll run off. So make sure your stone's bigger than you need it to be, because the first time you do this, you're going to make a mistake. Not make a mistake. It's not going to turn out the way you want it. But this one, as far as flavor goes, if you're going to make a novelty pizza, this Italian beef fat one is fantastic, incredibly unique. I don't even know if anybody outside of me has done that. It's a lot of work that goes into it. And then there's one other one here, which I just did on TV on WGN. There it is. Rendered cheese fat crust. So if you're making crisps, I made some the other day for my nephew. Grate some cheddar cheese, some Parmesan, whatever cheese you want. You bake it off in little 1 ounce circles. And you get these lacy looking crisps. You see them in salads a lot, or like steakhouses use them on potatoes and shit like that. What's happening is you're expelling all the fat out, a lot of the fat out, and then you're left with like the cheese solids, right? The crispiness. The fat gets left on the pan. Drain that off. Let that cool just a little bit if you want. Put that in your dough instead of butter or oil. Use that as your fat. And I go through fat content and fat types and hydration content and hydration types and stuff like that. It's very in depth. But you'll replace, basically, for the recipe you guys saw me do earlier, we used butter. We're just going to use rendered cheese fat for this one. I haven't made this with any toppings yet because this crust is just so intense. I don't want to mess with it with too many toppings. So I usually just do cheese pizza for this one. This is probably the most labor-intensive recipe that I have in here. But if you're going to do something and you want people to talk about it, you're doing a party or something like that, or you want that to be your thing, that rendered cheese fat crust is by far the most intense recipe that's in the book. But there's a bunch of recipes in there. They're all friggin' fantastic. And I'm not like a best guy, you know. There's no best this or best that. I don't like ranking things. Depends on the mood I'm in. The Chicago pizza I probably make most often, the Uncle Pepper's crispy Chicago dough recipe with sausage, pepper, and onion, which is very common here in the Chicago area. I probably make this the most, but I wouldn't necessarily call it the best, right? Like I like different things at different times. So we use the wooden peel to launch the pizza onto the stone. And you can see it's real thick. You know, we're half-inch thickness here or so. So to get the pizza off, you need tongs or some shit like that. Or you can use something real thin like this sheet metal one. This one's obviously a lot bigger than I need, but I already have one. I'm not a guy that likes to waste things, so I'm not going to get a new one until this breaks. We're at 10 minutes now. Oh, we're looking good. So you can pull this right now if you want. This would be considered cooked, well, done. I'm going to go a little bit longer. I like well done, but you can see the bottom is crispy already. I'm going to put this on the top stone I was telling you guys about to try and dry out the peppers a little bit, brown the cheese a little bit more. And the stone on top, even though it hasn't been used yet, we're going to add 90 seconds here. So it's a hot stone, but the crust itself has pretty much wicked away almost all of its hydration. So really what the top stone is doing is just bringing it to the top of the oven, and the heat is coming up and reflecting off the top and back down on the top of the pizza. And that's going to help brown the cheese, cook the peppers on a little bit. That's pretty much it. There's really nothing else to say about that, I guess. When we pull it out, I always put it on a rack for at least a couple minutes. That way, because you put it right on this cardboard, what happens is the pizza comes out, it's got all this moisture in it, it's hydration. I put it on the cardboard, it's going to steam. I don't want that. Put it on the rack, let some of that steam just kind of work its way out, and then we'll move it to the cardboard and we'll cut it. Like I was saying, there's really no right or wrong way to make pizza. Make pizza the way that you want to make the pizza. Four, three, two, one. I could even want another 10 seconds, but here we go. Look at this freaking thing. You could see how thin. I don't even know how to. Oh, here. There's a blade, right? Real thin. For comparison. blazing hot. Oh, that's hot, man. One of the characteristics if you're making a crispy thin crust in Chicago is that it's crisp throughout. So I want to, how do I, it's hot as shit. I'll just hold it up. You can see, oh man, that's hot. That's too freaking hot. But as you can see, it holds together incredibly well. Oh, this is split here, but go this way. Ah, that's too hot. It's too hot, but it's crispy as shit. Cut it here with my new pizza rocker. If you're going to start the endeavor into thin crust pizzas, these things are like $10. I don't know what the quality of them. They get better. There's some like $80 ones and shit out there. This one was $10. I have real bad wrists, so when I go to cut the pizza and you're using the pizza, you gotta cut it and put a lot of pressure in there. It's awkward. This thing is fantastic. I'm gonna show you how this works real quick. Every time I cut a pizza after I make them, there's flour on the counter. The pizza shoots out, so try and be conscious of that this time. So when I pulled this out, there's very crispy crust, so I cracked a couple spots. So for those purposes, I'll just follow that crack. You hear that? I don't know if you guys can hear that. I can fucking hear it. I am excited for this. This is hot. Another thing is I was talking about crispy and Chicago thin and stuff like that. I always eat the corners first. I'm not going to eat this piece right now because it's way too freaking hot. But if you could hold it up by the edge, that's a sign of a fantastic crispy pizza. I want to see what color we got on the bottom. Oh, that's beautiful. Like a fucking saltine. So, I'm Josh Downey, founder of Chicago Johnny's. You can find my cherry bourbon barbecue sauce and my olive oil giardiniera on store shelves locally at Jewel Osco stores, on Amazon, Walmart.com, and ChicagoJohnny's.com. This cookbook is available only through Amazon or my website, ChicagoJohnny's.com. This was Uncle Pepper's Crispy Chicago Dough recipe. This is a recipe I've been working on for 12 years now, I think. So this one and the semolina whole wheat crust are probably the closest to me because I've been working on those the longest. Page 30 and 31, if you get the book. Tell everybody you know about it if you like it. If you don't, keep your mouth shut. I don't need that negative publicity. Thank you for joining me.